Welcome again, everyone. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia struck Ukraine with 90 missiles and 100 drones overnight in response to Ukraine's attacks with UK and US weapons last week. He says Russia is selecting targets in Ukraine that could include decision-making centers in Kyiv. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky gave the same figures in a statement he made earlier, saying cluster munitions were used specifically against civilian infrastructure. Ukraine used UK and US weapons to strike Russian territory for the first time last week, which prompted retaliatory strikes from Russia. More than 1 million Ukrainians have been left without power following the overnight assault. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky describes the attack as a vile escalation. Ukrainian officials have been warning for some time that Russia has been stockpiling cruise and ballistic missiles in order to launch coordinated countrywide attacks on Ukraine's energy system. And as Russia launched a widespread missile attack on Ukraine, people took shelter in Kyiv metro. Russia carried out its second big attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure this month on Thursday, with national and local officials reporting blasts and emergency power cuts across the country, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Ukraine's national grid operator, Ukraine Energo, introduced emergency power cuts amid the attack. The top private power company, D-Tech, also said the power cuts impacted the Kyiv region as well as Odessa, Dnipro, and Donetsk regions. Russia previously staged 10 massive attacks on the country's energy infrastructure, which hobbled the system and spurred fears of long power cuts ahead of the winter months. Let's get more on this. Security analyst Chidi Nwanu joins us now. Chidi, great to see you again today. Right, so let's begin with your assessment of the new level of warfare we are seeing in Ukraine, with the US and UK weapons being used by Ukraine, and President Putin saying this latest attack is a retaliation for that.
Yes, well, I mean, the pattern of attacks hasn't changed since, this war has begun. The Russians have consistently targeted Ukrainian power infrastructure, Ukrainian civil infrastructure, particularly during the winter period. The first year of the war, there was the famous kind of phrase of, winter is coming. And this has been quite consistent. Now, the Russians haven't let up throughout the years, throughout the summer, throughout the autumn, in their attacks on Ukraine's energy sector. And this has had an effect. Ukraine is now suffering severe power shortages, which I'm sure to Nigerians will not be a surprise. But, in Ukraine and in Europe, that's quite a big deal. And the part of the problem for the Ukrainians is that this is while the Russians can quite legitimately claim that targeting the power sector has a military purpose, which it does, because the Ukrainian train network runs on electricity. It also powers Ukrainian cities, and Ukrainian heating for their cities and for their towns is centrally supplied, which needs a power supply. So when you take out the power supply, it doesn't only take out power for the trains, it takes out power for homes, for heating. And in Ukrainian winter, where it gets very, very cold, this is literally a death sentence for a lot of people. So it's a predictable Russian tactic. It's no change from their previous tactics, but it's more severe this year because because of the persistence of these attacks. It's having a much more significant effect.
Right. We have seen Russia targeting Ukraine's infrastructure before. You did say, right now the targeting is much more significant because, it's the winter period. What happened then when Russia attacked Ukraine's, power infrastructure to what it's doing now? Why is it being more deliberate now?
Well, the point is, it's just if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, there is only a limit to how much Ukraine can defend. So the Russians have gone from using, the fairly sophisticated and expensive, cruise missiles to using these Shahed drones. They've been able to, these are originally Iranian supplied Shahed drones, which are now produced in Russia and called the Garan drones. Now, these are much cheaper to make and, much harder to shoot down because they don't fly at a typical profile that can be identified by radars or sophisticated air defense systems. And at the same time, they're quite cheap, in terms of, modern munitions. So using multiples of them, rather than using one cruise missile, you could use 5 or 6 command drones. And if even if most of them are shot down, if 2 or 3 get through, it has an effect. So this is, as I said, the Russians have been consistent and persistent in doing this throughout the year, as well as upping their game now as winter's come. So some of the biggest strikes have taken place in the last few months, and this has had a cumulative effect on the Ukrainians.
Right, and looking at the intricacies, of the war and the weapons used on both sides, and of course international involvement, how closer or further away to the end of this war do you see?
It's a very difficult question because where we are in the war is that both sides, frankly, have fought themselves to almost not to a standstill, but to exhaustion. The Russians are advancing, but they're advancing very, very slowly and with very, very high casualties. Now, they have the ability to absorb these casualties by virtue of obviously having a much larger population, but also by recruiting lots of foreigners, either some from Africa, some from Asia, some from South America, some from Central Asia, and obviously, the often reported North Koreans, as well as now people from the Middle East, allegedly. At the same time, the Ukrainians don't have that advantage. Their population is much smaller. While they've had a lot of foreign volunteers come in, quite a few have been killed, quite a few have been wounded, and quite a few have just left because the war is quite terrible and terrifying for everybody. At the same time, the Ukrainians have had a fairly deliberate mobilization policy in which they've mobilized mostly older males for their war efforts, keeping the younger male population, to be quite brutal, to stay within the workforce, and also to keep having children so they can preserve their population for future generations. Now, they will be forced to a decision point where they will have to start lowering the recruiting age more and more. This has already started happening, but the more they lower the recruiting age, the less men, the more men they'll have. But it's a bigger problem for them in the future, in that they'll have much less menfolk in their population. So both sides are kind of in a really brutal game of chicken as to which side is going to break first, which side is going to run out of men first, which side is going to run out of ammunition first. The Russian calculus is very much predicated on Western support for Ukraine breaking, and therefore Ukraine's ability to fight, as well as their will to fight, breaking. The victory of Trump in the US election seems to have given them that an additional impetus or an additional sign that this may come, but Trump's unpredictability means that nobody knows exactly what he's going to do. His solution could be to supply Ukraine with more weapons, to force Russia to the table, or abandon Ukraine completely. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I don't know. But the long and short of it is that this war, is reaching a decision point where both sides will have to find a solution, or at least a pause. And it's just which side is going to have the advantage when that time comes.
Right, and speaking, you just talked about the new administration coming in January. We're not really sure what Donald Trump is going to do when he takes, over affairs at the White House. His foreign policy, we don't know the direction it's going to go with the U.S. We know that U.S. is in support. Usually, Russia is an ally of the United States. But how do you think it's going to go, really, if we dig deeper into it? Do you think foreign policy will change? Do you think Donald Trump will say, what, Putin, I know that, you're the aggressor, you want to ensure that, you pass a message to Kyiv and to the rest of the world, but it's time to stop. We'll work things out. We'll find another way around, getting Kyiv to bow or to do what we want to do.
Oh, again, one of the benefits of Trump as a president, or the Trump presidency, is he's very unpredictable. He has no central guiding philosophy. The benefit to the rest of the world of President Biden is that everybody kind of understood where he was or who he was. He was an old school kind of U.S. politician, kind of very much in favor of the Euro-Atlantic alliance, very much convinced that Russia was an adversary that needed to be contested. And this, we saw throughout his policies and the way he has supported Ukraine, maybe not in the way that many of us who analyze these things would think is the most effective way, but he's still been able to, keep Ukraine in the fight. The difference is that President Trump, or future President Trump, has a very different kind of philosophy. He's very transactional, so he's looking to get something back from either side, either it be from the Ukrainians or from the Russians. He's also, very mercurial. Many of his supporters or his followers do not believe that the Ukraine war is worth fighting or is America's war. So he could either follow the crowd or follow his supporters and say he's not interested in this war, or he could do his own thing. As I said, his solution could be to pump Ukraine full of weapons, so he could prove to the world that he is better than Biden. As I think I maybe said this to one of your colleagues. It's the difference between Mosul and Kabul. The Mosul solution for him is back when America was fighting the Islamic State. It's almost the same thing. Obama started the fight against Islamic State. Trump took over, and the fight ended on his watch. He was able to claim that victory, even though everything that happened was because of things that happened during the Obama administration. He could do exactly the same thing here. He could claim, he could finish this fight, pump lots of weapons into Ukraine, challenge the Russians to fight to the finish, as I said, challenge all of their weaknesses, and then force them to the negotiating table. Or he could do exactly the opposite, do like Biden did in Kabul, and just say, I don't care about the consequences, I'm going to pull out. There is no way anybody can predict. I don't think Trump himself knows what he's going to do. Genuinely, I don't think anybody knows until he takes office and he's presented with this problem on day one.
Right. And do you think, when Trump was, previously president, there was a perceived relationship he had with Moscow. Russia is, retaliating against Kyiv now because it says that Kyiv is using weapons from the United States and from the United Kingdom. With this perceived relationship, once Trump is sworn in, do you think Vladimir Putin will expect, the same backing, so to speak, that he had before when Trump was in the White House?
It's very difficult because Trump is obviously very aware that this is the perception, and he's very aware that any sign of weakness or kind of giving in to Putin will just be flagged up as well. We told you he's Putin's lapdog, or he's Putin's person. So Trump has to be very conscious of that, which could, as I was alluding to earlier, could mean that he overreacts and he overcompensates by pushing weapons into Ukraine and giving much more support to Ukraine. But as I said, Trump is very transactional, and also part of the problem many people have with President or former President Trump is that he's also he's very easy to manipulate. So Putin last time just did the same thing that the North Korean dictator did, praised him, showed him a lot of favor, showed him a lot of attention, and he kind of folded under his influence. And Putin could do the same thing now, but it's unlikely that the same things can repeat themselves, because as I said, the world is different, the world has changed. Trump is not surrounded by the people he was surrounded by before, who many of them were quite worldly and were quite understanding of the situation. A lot of the people around him now are quite inexperienced and very ideological. So it's very unclear, and it would be a very brave analyst who would sit in front of you and say this is what's going to happen. The best anyone can advise is prepare for all eventualities and understand what you want to get out of this situation, and and look for it. So a country like Nigeria now, looking at this situation, we should be as Nigerians, we should be looking to say, if this war continues, the price of, part of the strategy could be to drop the price of oil on the global stage. The Americans could flood the market with oil so that the price of oil drops in order to bankrupt Russia. What is Nigeria's strategy to counter that? The alternative could be, if the Americans, as you said, Trump, falls under Putin's spell, lifts all the sanctions, the Russians could, increase the price of oil, and we could have an oil boom. Nigeria needs to. So I use Nigeria as an example here. Now, countries like Nigeria need to be looking at the situation. Now, we can't influence it, but we are going to be dealt with some of the second and third order effects, whatever happens. Other things like the price of food. If this war continues and food supplies become restricted, how does Nigeria, that imports so much of its food, deal with the increased cost of food, the increased cost of fuel? These are the things that countries need to be looking at. It's very difficult to predict what Putin will do, what Ukraine will do. Russian soldiers could all crack on the front and fall back. The Ukrainians could, be overrun tomorrow. We don't know, but what we do know is that whatever happens, there are going to be problems for everybody in the future.
Right, and finally, back at the front, it's the second year, of second winter, I believe, of this war in Ukraine, and I don't know if we sense wariness on the part of both troops. You did say before that Ukraine's strategy was to recruit older men, because it wants its younger population to remain in case, whatever, so that, reproduction can continue. But this is winter, and winter, it's a lot, fighting on one hand is one thing, but fighting, in knee-high, thigh-high snow and treacherous weather is another thing. How do you think the troops are braving it on both sides, really?
They'll be very, very, very miserable. That's the first thing. As somebody who's, as a soldier, I've served in cold weather, and it's not pleasant. Nothing as cold as, Eastern Ukraine, but even the colds of, Wales or Scotland or England is enough for me. Maybe as a Nigerian, I'm at a double disadvantage, but it's not just the physical discomfort. The first thing is that in order to counter the cold, so the most important thing to understand is a human being can operate in any climate or in any temperature or in any terrain. It's just you need a lot of things to keep you going. So you need to keep warm. Physically, as human beings, we can't survive without heat. And we need the right amount of type of clothing, but you also need other like heat sources, like fires, whatever it is. Now, the problem with that is that it creates an additional problem. You create a heat source, and not only do you create light, but you create a thermal signature, which can be detected by sensors. Other things like fuel, lubricants freeze at certain temperatures, so you need special fuels, you need special lubricants. Engines will seize up, so you need to keep running engines. Weapons will seize up, will freeze, so you need special lubricants, or you need to try and keep them warm as well. It just makes fighting so much more difficult. And the cold is not just a physical thing; it's a physical, psychological, physiological thing. It makes you tired. It saps your energy. It takes a lot of energy to keep warm in the cold. So you're tired. You need much more high-calorie food. You need hot food going into your body, to keep your core temperature up. So these are now logistical problems which both sides have to face. Now, the Russians are traditionally much better at winter fighting than most armies, and they've shown during this war that they've been able to sustain their tempo and their offensives during the winter months. They've been doing the same thing this year as they did last year, and to be honest, as I said earlier, they're doing it much more successfully than they did the last 2 years, but with very high casualties. But it is imposing a huge logistic strain on them. It's imposing a huge logistic strain on the Ukrainians. So for the individual soldiers in the trenches, in the tanks, in the armored vehicles, they will be suffering. They'll be tired, they'll be cold, they'll be miserable, they'll be hoping for the war to end. For the armies writ large, they'll be enduring much larger logistical problems, which is why, as I said at the beginning, Russia's attacks on Ukraine's electricity networks is part of that strategy to put more strain on Ukraine's trains, on Ukraine's logistics, forcing them to use more vehicles, which means they're consuming more fuel, which means that drivers are more tired. And it's all of these cumulative effects which they hope to use to break the will of the Ukrainians, on the battlefront.
Right, Chidi, a pleasure having you again on the program. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that.
Thank you for having me.